So I have always been fascinated by sex. Not just the having of it, but in the ways that we discuss it as a society and the ways that we're taught about it. I had my first sex talk when I was 16, and my mom said, "Let us know when you start having sex, because we're going to get you on birth control." I had my second sex talk at 18, and my dad said, "If you get pregnant, you're getting an abortion because you are going to college." End of sex talks. Now, never mind the fact that I wasn't even having sex in high school, and not to ding my parents, who are both physicians, but it was clear that they knew the clinical information, but they just didn't have the comfort level to talk to their kids about sex. Now, in my Catholic Sunday school days, I got a very different message about sex, and it was one that left me feeling like I was supposed to feel pretty ashamed about something that felt very natural to me. And the message that I left with was, you definitely better not have sex unless you're married, especially if you're trying to have a kid. That's when you should be doing it. Never mind that I definitely wasn't thinking about getting married or having children when I was that young. I was lucky enough to receive comprehensive sex ed when I was in school, but again, it was still very clinical. But we did get to learn a lot about prevention methods, so I learned about all the birth control options that were available. Like most of us, I saw porn before I was ready to. And I thought to myself, well, looks like that feels really good for the man. It was really only in my group of friends that I had an open, non-judgmental environment within which that we could talk about anything about sex, relationships, and all the ways that sex felt good. Now, I bet you can guess that all of these different ways that I learned about sex did not leave me feeling very prepared for life as a sexually active adult. Now, I have less than 18 minutes to talk to you about sex. I could talk about sex for days. But in the over 10 years that I've spent as a sex educator and 3.5 years of running a blog called Healthy Sex and You, what I've learned above and beyond everything is that no matter what scary stuff you throw at people, it will never be enough to make them not want to have sex. Because do you know why people want to have sex? The pursuit of pleasure. What I'm arguing for is the addition of the discussion of pleasure to comprehensive sex ed. They actually have models of this happening around the world with very high degrees of success. In countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and France, they can boast some of the lowest rates of sexually transmitted infections, teen pregnancies, and unwanted pregnancies, while also having the highest sexual satisfaction rates in the world. In the US, most funded sex ed in schools is abstinence only or abstinence plus, both which stress the message that sex is only okay after marriage. So what has this abstinence education gotten us in our country so far? By age 21, 85% of men and 81% of women have already engaged in sex. To compare, the median age of marriage is 29 for men and 27 for women. So by this statistic alone, I think we all can safely say that the message of abstinence education is not working. In fact, most people have multiple partners before they get married. Only 22 states require that sex ed be taught in schools, and of those, only 13 require that the instruction be medically accurate. 37 states require that information on abstinence be provided and or stressed. Now, what about our LGBTQIA+ students? Only 48% of schools address sexual identity or sexual orientation in any fashion. In states like Oklahoma, where HIV education is mandated, it must state that homosexuality is responsible for contact with the AIDS virus. So you'd think with these statistics, and I could go on, would be enough to start moving us away from this type of model. Unfortunately, no. Congress recently increased its funding of abstinence education from $50 million to $75 million per year, with states matching a portion of that. Now, what does the typical abstinence education curricula look like? Well, first, there's heavy emphasis on the discussion of the body. So we talk about puberty, we talk about hygiene, we talk about reproductive organs, anatomy and physiology, the very clinical medical stuff. And almost all of this has a heavy focus on pregnancy. Then we start talking about the scary stuff, So I think we can all remember those pictures of genitals that were riddled with sexually transmitted infections and how horrified we were when those popped up on the screens. In abstinence education, there's also many, many discussions about how if you get pregnant before you're married, it will ruin your life. Many abstinence sex ed curricula also discuss that if you have sex before marriage, you are at risk of some severe mental health issues. In fact, you should be prepared to experience depression and anxiety. The message of "don't be a slut" is probably one of the main things that we all walk away from abstinence education remembering. And this message is mainly targeted towards women. And we see this in things like purity rings, virginity pledges, daddy-daughter dances. And the big one, that if you have sex, you will get HIV and die, tends to be a real sticking point in abstinence sex ed. Now, in Abstinence Plus, there may be a discussion of prevention methods. But like I said before, most states don't actually require that this education be medically accurate. So many times, abstinence sex ed education will give misleading or outright incorrect information on the efficacy of certain contraceptive methods. Now, what kind of sex is this preparing young people to have? Sex between heterosexual partners. And if we're being honest, sex that doesn't sound like it's a whole lot of fun. This is sex that maybe two robots could have, or two unemotional human beings could have. Really, this is sex that's not relevant for anyone who is interested in sexual activity. Now, this video is something that's very typical of the videos that they show in abstinence education curricula.
She's gonna hate me, she's gonna hate me. I'm only 17 years old. Dang. How am I gonna tell her? Am I gonna die? My future, my life. What about my scholarship? I messed up big time.
What am I gonna do? I'm not ready for this. What's he gonna say? I can't believe this. How did this happen? What about my life? How am I gonna tell him? I'm only 16 years old. I had my whole life in front of me.
Something to tell you.
I have something to tell you too.
You go first.
I'm pregnant.
You're what?
We're pregnant. What are we gonna do?
I have something to tell you.
What? What is it?
I have AIDS.
If you could actually let that play for one more second, you can see the bottom message that pops up. Right there. So this video is misleading in all sorts of ways, and I don't think I have enough time to go through all of them. But the statistic, let's start with the statistic. 25% of carriers of the AIDS virus don't know they have it. This is actually a very old statistic, almost a decade old, in fact. The most recent estimates from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may put this around closer to 13%. So there's one. The website, jordancdc.org, makes you think that this is somehow affiliated with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. When in fact you go to this website, this is a faith-based organization whose main job is to send speakers out to various groups to talk about things like abstinence education and financial management, because those two fit together. They are not science-based, they're not medicine-based, they are not public health-based. So the message that abstinence education curricula leaves us with is that sex is not fun. Sex is dirty and disgusting, and you're a bad person if you have it before marriage. We have a large body of evidence that shows that using scare tactics to change human behavior does not work. In fact, it tends to do the opposite. When people want to have sex, they will have sex. So what if we tried shifting the sex ed framework? We would first still need to talk about the body. So this would include discussions of puberty, hygiene, anatomy, reproductive anatomy, and physiology. But we also need to add in the discussion of evolution and how evolution has changed the way the male and female forms are. We need to talk about how intersex children are created, the biology of the body, and how our interactions with the environment have changed the way our brains function. So we see things like gender identity and sexual identity across a very fluid spectrum. And we also need to talk about the naturalness of sexual desire, because without it, none of us would even want to have sex, because the main purpose of sex is to procreate. We also need to talk about prevention. So this would include how to put a condom on, how to use lube to create less friction, which creates fewer tears, how to get tested, what an annual exam is like and how to be prepared for one, how to delay sex, how to negotiate and use various birth control options. What if we also talked about self-esteem? So this would include feeling positive about oneself and your body, and also your own decision-making skills. This would include a discussion of setting healthy boundaries, healthy socialization skills amongst your peers. This would also include how to be assertive, which is a skill all adults need. You also need negotiating skills. And you also need to know how to give and receive consent. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but I didn't say the word sex at all in the self-esteem portion. And there's a reason for that. In the Netherlands, they actually start this discussion in kindergarten, but they consider this part of sex ed. They do this because these are the foundational skills that everyone needs in order to enjoy healthy sexuality. And of course, we need to talk about pleasure. So this would include discussion of how masturbation can lead not only to discoveries of self, but help you tell a partner what you want. The roles of affection and bonding, and how things like neurotransmitters and hormones play huge roles in how we feel about other people, whether it's short-term or long-term. Healthy communication between partners, and how to create an open, respectful, and trustful dialogue between a partner so that you can ask for what you want. And then we also need to talk about porn as fiction. Many of us are not taught that porn is something that is extremely false. It's acting. So how can you talk about that within a sexual relationship? And how can you actually use it to your advantage? Now, what kind of sex is this type of sex ed preparing young people for? Good sex between any consenting partners. And by partners, I mean anyone who is LGBTQIA+, or disabled, or elderly, or all of the above. If we combine the discussion of self-esteem and prevention, we could talk about how you actually have real conversations with partners about how to get tested and how to use birth control options within a sexual relationship. It also includes ways like how to delay sex, how to say a definitive no and a definitive yes, and at the same time, how to hear a definitive no and a definitive yes. Combining the discussion of prevention and pleasure can include ways like how to put condoms on in very sexy ways, how to go shopping with your partner for things like condoms, lube, or even sex toys. Combining the discussion of prevention, self-esteem, and pleasure can include things like how to discuss mutual masturbation or how to experiment in your relationship in safe and trustful ways. So what kind of message is this type of sex ed leaving us with? Sex can be fun and safe, and you deserve a healthy, fulfilling sex life with a partner or partners you trust. Now imagine a world where this is the message that we all receive about sex. I'm willing to bet that most people in this room did not receive this message growing up. But I'm here to tell you that you do deserve a sex life like this. You deserve to have sex with someone who respects you because you respect yourself. You deserve to have sex that you can excitedly consent to. You deserve to have sex that is not harmful, that is not abusive. Sex that you can ask for without being afraid of, and you're not afraid of being rejected for. Sex where it's good. So imagine rates of things like sexual assault falling, because people now know how to assertively say no, and people know how to hear that no. And they no longer feel the need to exert their power over somebody else because they also have high self-esteem. Imagine rates of testing going up because people now feel comfortable having those difficult discussions with the partner, and they feel good going to a clinic. Imagine rates of sexually transmitted infections and unwanted pregnancies going down because people have found a method that works for them and they feel good using it. Imagine rates of sexual satisfaction going up because people now have the vocabulary to tell their partner what they want and they feel no shame asking for it. What I hope you leave with is a desire to critically reanalyze the messages that you received about sex growing up. If this was not the message, I'm going to emphasize that it should be. Because we all deserve to have good sex. Talking about pleasure in sex ed is not only the right thing to do, it's the just thing to do. And it feels really good to talk about it. Thank you.